All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever everyone is around the world. Welcome to Procrastinators Unite. My name is John Miles from Admission Auto, and with me we have
Talon Rindels from the MBA Exchange. Welcome, everybody. We'd love to get to know who we have on the line today. So please go ahead and type in the chat box who you are, where you're from, what your dream school might be. And then, of course, throughout the presentation, please ask questions throughout. We don't need to save them till the end. We want to address them as they're top of mind for you and relevant. So please, let's make this as interactive as possible. We're really excited to have you here today. Maybe we have some procrastinators on the line, and maybe we just have some, recession-driven MBA applicants who are saying, the job market isn't looking so hot in the future potentially with a looming recession coming. Maybe now is the time for my MBA, and I might be just a little bit further behind than I had anticipated. Whoever you are, whatever is driving you to Procrastinators Unite, I assure you that John and I are here to help to support. We're really here to settle that angst, determine what is possible for you for this MBA admissions round, and then give you some clear action steps on how you can really bring it all to life. We'll do that with kind of 4 key agenda items here. Of course, we want to share with you who myself is, who John is, and why you might want to listen to us. We'll give you some context on, how the admission year is really looking from our perspective. Working for an MBA admissions firm, both John and I, we talk to a lot of candidates. We see a lot of what is out there and have some insider info, on how the admissions year is looking. And then, of course, we'll go into probably what you all are here for is those top 5 focus areas that'll get you the highest ROI in the weeks before those MBA admissions deadlines. Then we'll wrap up with just kind of some closing thoughts and, of course, any remaining questions that you might still have. Go ahead and type in the chat box. We really do want to know who you are and where you're from.
And make it as interactive as possible, folks. So we'll, as we go along, we'll try to jump in when we're on certain slides after the intros and answer questions as we go along.
Perfect. All right. Well, let me introduce myself and also, the firms, right? So why do we have 2 MBA admissions firms here, right? We are 2 powerhouse MBA admissions firms that have been around for quite some time, dating all the way back to 1996. We have recently joined forces to bring MBA or prospective MBA candidates like you, more experts, more strategic planning, and results all under one virtual roof. We both offer full services, everything from GMAT and GRE tutoring to serving as your captain, through every step of this admissions process, from that upfront discovery and introspection and candidacy shaping, all the way through every step of the application, including waitlist and offer management. As I mentioned earlier, myself specifically, I'm Talon Rindels. I'm based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. But we have consultants all over the world, and John is also in a different place. I've been serving as an admissions consultant for the MBA Exchange for well over half a decade now, and we're really excited to be here today to help to kind of broaden your toolkit. I am a Kellogg MBA alum, approaching my 10-year anniversary. Time sure flies. I've served as an alumni interviewer for Kellogg over the years. And, one of the key things that I really do to stay active as an alumni today is that I serve as a student advisor to current students who are interested in getting into CPG or retail, which is really my area of expertise, from an industry perspective. When I was applying for my MBA, one thing that I initially thought that I should actually hide in this process was the fact that I was a first-generation college grad and didn't have any connections within my family or really friends at all to the MBA world. But what I learned very quickly on in applying to my MBA is that is actually, my superpower. It's something that made me really unique and special. So I thought that I would mention that today with you. Now, from an industry perspective, I've really focused my post-MBA career on general management across CPG and retail from a number of different angles, both from a marketing or brand management perspective, from retail perspective, working as a merchant, and then also from a sales or customer development lens. What I'm really passionate about is storytelling, whether that's brands, whether that's, retailers, whether that's your story, your MBA admission story. And so through all walks of life, that's really a key focus area for me. And I actually teach workshops specifically to help people to tell their stories in a more compelling way. I'm also really passionate about inclusion. And so one of the things that I do in the community is I serve as an ambassador for the network of executive women, which helps to really drive that inclusion in the workforce and really empower women to bring out the best in them. I love to stay active. I really can't sit still. So I'm a marathon runner. I'm a triathlete. I helped to start up the Run, Bike, Swim or Triathlon Club at Kellogg that is still going strong today. And as you can see from the artwork behind me, I'm also a mother. And I like to bring my whole self to work and to everything that I do, which is why you see my kids' beautiful paintings. We are not a very artistic family, as you may be able to tell, but I still love, bringing my whole self to work by bringing their artwork to my background here. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you, Talon, and hello. And so John Miles again, and similar to Talon, I have a kind of a storytelling focus as well, but decided a few years ago to kind of do it in a different route. Before I kind of get into that, sort of have always kind of taken a multidisciplinary approach to my education and profession. So was almost going to go to med school, was an English literature major, ended up working at Goldman Sachs in investments for 8 years before returning to Fuqua. At Fuqua, I did a concentration in health sector management, again, to throw another curveball into everything. Worked at biotech in the summer and spent a lot of time ultimately deciding to go off and start a cross-sector, as it might make sense now, venture development company, which was Art and Science Collaborative. Then joined a client, which was Millennium Dance Complex, which is a very famous studio in Los Angeles, in the hopes of basically commercializing and making kind of the first lifestyle dance brand. Because if you think about it, there really is no lifestyle dance brand. So it is around that time in 2016 that I joined Admission Auto and am now a head consultant there and working really with north of 250 people over those years from all over the world. And my current work is working for myself, my own company, where I am a creative advisor for both people and brands. So I use really short form creative writing. So poems, I write lyrics for composers, songwriters, producers. So I took kind of a bit of a turn a number of years ago, kind of combining the business and the art world, which is kind of what I've always been. It just took a long time to figure out how to do that best. So that is me in a nutshell. But ultimately, what we focus on a lot, Talon and I, is really getting into the narrative of you. Everyone will have good things on paper, good grades, maybe extracurriculars, but we've got to get into the shaping incidents in your life and whatnot. And these final weeks before the applications are due, you're going to see kind of ways as we go on the presentation to focus in on that. So we're not just kind of regurgitating your resume and the essays, but actually bringing you to life in ways that are going to make them say, we've got to meet this person. We've got to give them an interview.
All right, so let's lay out just a little bit of context for how this admission year is looking. So first and foremost, we are expecting, of course we don't have a crystal ball, but we are expecting the round 2 MBA applicant pool, to be really fierce. Yeah. So the reason is that whenever there is a looming economic downturn, whenever the, economic sentiment and confidence begins to get a little bit low, we tend to see a big spike in MBA applicants. They're worried about the job market. They're not sure if they're going to lose their job. They may have lost their job, right? And that tends to say, okay, now is the time for me to go get that MBA and figure out what's next for me. Now, what I will say is that this is all fairly new. In the last 30 to 60 days, we have seen such a huge uptick in candidates coming to us saying, do I still have time to apply to my MBA? I'm just trying to get my head around this. What do I do? And we'd really attribute that, to this economic uncertainty that's out there right now. And so a lot of those candidates, they aren't ready for round one, and therefore they're likely going to be those round two candidates. And so that applicant pool is expected to be very fierce from our perspective right now. So that might be why some of you are all here, thinking about the fact that, we've got several deadlines coming up in the next week and a half. HBS is out there, GSB is not that far behind. And those, for some of you, may not be realistic to meet at this point, especially if you have been a procrastinator or someone who's decided more recently that this is the year for you. That said, there are a lot of great top 25 schools that have application deadlines that are, 3, 4, 5, even 6 weeks away. I've listed a bunch of them here. This is over half of the top 25 schools have deadlines that are still over 3 weeks away. And so for some of you, a hybrid combination of round one and round two applications could be a really, really great option. A lot of candidates don't even tend to consider this as an option. They think, either I'm a round one candidate or I'm a round two candidate. And I might encourage you to think a little bit differently, especially knowing, what we see from our crystal ball that may not be perfect, but is really backed by some real expertise based on what we're seeing in that crystal ball for round two. So when you think about it, your first application is just never going to be your best. So let's say HBS, GSB, those are your top two dream schools. You actually wouldn't want those to be the first schools that you work on anyway. So potentially what you could do is focus on some of these schools listed here on as having application deadlines a little bit later in the round one process, and crank out 2, 3, 4, 5 applications for round one, and then hit it really strong for round two when you're most savvy in this process, to really go for your dream schools. Sure, this may make you, spend a few $1,000s on a deposit for one of your round one schools that you were lucky enough to get accepted to while you await your decision from round two. But I'd say that's a really small price to pay if it ends up that you get into your dream school in round two. So something to consider as we go about our discussion today on what needs to be true and how to really set yourself up for success in the time that we still have before those applications are due.
Thank you, Talon. And so let's look a little bit into kind of what are the focus areas as we get near these deadlines. And we're going to kind of look at it really across five areas. The first is going to be talking about your board of directors. And there's an emphasis on doing that now. And we'll get into kind of what that means in terms of the composition of those people, resources, et cetera. The second is a timeline. A lot of folks who work in consulting or even biotech, drug development, let's say, we're used to like a Gantt chart. Similar thing going on here in sort of the final kind of project management methods. I'd say that you don't want to kind of overdo it because there is a fluidity to the moving pieces of letters of recommenders getting back to you, et cetera. So, but you do want to have a rough time frame so that you're not kind of overloading in those final 5 days when there can be technical glitches on the online app. And we're going to talk about some of the things to think about, particularly as related to the online application. This one's important in terms of your top 5 experiences. If you are trying to reuse some content, which is totally normal and appropriate, with some caveats, you really want to identify your top stories. What are those narratives that you want to make sure are in all these applications that are not necessarily specifically tied to your goals, but more about you, whether it's the leadership story or the value story or the challenge story, because you're only going to get so many chances to reveal those types of narratives in an application, including your interview. The fourth is what we kind of have as a 4-step process for writing your essays. We'll talk about really what that ultimately begins with, which is following instructions and answering the prompt, which when you're reusing content gets a little tricky in terms of potentially copying and pasting, and will get picked up on by admissions very quickly. The last is networking. You can still do that in these remaining weeks, and you can do it in a very genuine and authentic way, which Talon will get into, versus sort of just name dropping.
All right, let's start with number 1. So one thing is for sure, you absolutely cannot embark on your MBA admissions process alone. There are some key people that you absolutely need by your side. And it's important that you engage those folks now. So even if you don't know, what you're going to need them for exactly, and you don't have your timeline all created yet, I do recommend that you at least get on their radar. You want to be as respectful as possible in working with these folks and setting expectations appropriately so that they can plan accordingly. Even if you're a procrastinator, they may not be a procrastinator and want to be able to plan their schedule accordingly. So there's the obvious folks who you need by your side, your recommenders, and I'll talk through that in just a second. But there's another pool of folks that often goes unknown or unnoticed that I really want to spend some time on as well. We'll start with recommenders though. So first and foremost, yes, you absolutely can't go about this process alone because a letter of recommendation is a part of the application process, right? Generally, candidates will have two. Of course, most schools say we want your current manager, right? Somebody in your direct reporting line who can speak to your performance and your development. Of course, there are situations where candidates, do not want to let their employer know that they will be applying for their MBA, or there are other unique circumstances that could lead you not to want to engage that manager. And of course, you can reference, why you didn't select that person, that manager, as your recommender in your optional essay. But if you can, by all means, we do recommend that you go ahead with that recommendation from the school that your current manager is one of your recommenders. But for that second recommender, and or if you have a unique circumstance where you can't use your current manager, who else do you choose, right? I think the most common choice is people say, oh, I just want to find somebody who is a Harvard grad, a M7 grad, whatever that is, who has a super awesome title, and I want that person to write me a letter of recommendation. Now, that is not always the smartest choice because it is very important that that person really knows you and can authentically speak to who you are, how you've grown, and your work. So I would be really thoughtful and strategic on who you choose. Yes, of course, if they have an MBA and an MBA from a top program, and they know you, yes, they very well might be that right choice. But I encourage you to think of, others that maybe aren't as obvious based on their credentials. So a cross-functional partner or a client can be a really good option. This is someone who will who will really bring a different lens to your candidacy, because oftentimes a client or a cross-functional partner has slightly different goals than you have. So they can speak to how you can kind of marry up seemingly conflicting goals to ultimately, achieve mutual growth for the organization in a way that works for both functions or for both the client and your employer. So that can often be a very smart choice. A lot of times, we get candidates coming saying, hey, I have such a great relationship with my professor at, such and such a school. Should I use that person as a recommender? Generally speaking, we do tend to shy away from professors. However, if it's a really deep relationship that you've continued to harness, maybe through extracurriculars in the community and things like that, potentially, a professor from your university days could make sense. But it's not necessarily always, the preferred. And then, of course, if you're extremely active in the community, there could be a great option for a recommender, who can speak to what you've done, working with a nonprofit, starting up a nonprofit, whatever that is, your engagement in the community. There could be some great folks who can speak well to what you bring to the table. Now, what I think is really important is that you make this process as easy as possible on your recommenders. I think about this, at work too, with my performance reviews. Man, before my manager is going to go in to speak on my behalf, I make it easy for them. I tell them all the great things I've done. I showcase how I've grown so that we make it easy for them to speak on your behalf. I recommend that same thing in this situation as well. Put together a playbook. Make sure they have your resume. Make sure they understand your goals and why you are applying to the schools you're applying to, or why you're applying to an MBA to begin with. If you have performance reviews, from your time with them, go ahead and put that in this playbook. It's also important that you highlight What are your strengths in your candidacy? And where are your vulnerabilities that you're working to overcome? And then also, hopefully they know enough about you that they know what you're doing in the community, but just in case not, or to remind them, let them know all the great things that you're doing beyond the workplace as well. Now, you want to be really clear in what you are hoping for them to convey through the recommendation letter. Because when you think about your entire application, it's really a chapter book. There are certain things that come about in your essays. There are certain things that will come about in your recommendation letters. There are certain things that'll come about via short answers, right? And you want to be really strategic so that you paint a holistic picture throughout every piece of that application. And so maybe there are strengths that you're highlighting in other areas that they may not need to focus on. So what I recommend that you do is say, hey, when I think about my MBA candidacy, here are my strengths, here are my vulnerabilities. If it's authentic to you and you agree with these are maybe the 2 strengths I really want to see if you could highlight. And then there's this one vulnerability that I would love if you could talk about how we've worked together for me to grow in that area. Really demonstrating that you're coachable, demonstrating that you're reflective and can learn from things that maybe you haven't done as well is really, really important to AdCom. And your recommenders are excellent people to be able to bring those attributes out. And so if you can be as clear as possible with your recommenders on, the specific types of experiences that you want them to bring out, again, if it's authentic and they agree, that is really what can set you up for success the best. Now, in a spirit of making this as easy as possible on your recommenders, I want to call out that there is a common letter of recommendation, and not every school uses it, but quite a few do. Cornell, Tuck, Fuqua, Stanford, Yale. There's quite a few that are on that list. This can definitely ease the burden on your recommenders, especially if you're a candidate that's applying to 8 to 10 schools. Writing 8 to 10 recommendation letters is a really time-consuming process. So if you can whittle that down to only 2 or 3, the common letter of recommendation that can be cascaded to many schools, and then maybe 1 or 2 for the schools that aren't on there, that would significantly reduce the workload on your recommenders and probably also improve the output if they don't have quite as much of a workload when it comes to this process. Now, the right-hand side of the screen, candidacy reviewers. So this is something that a lot of candidates just don't often think about, but I highly encourage you, beyond your recommenders, to have other people on your board of directors for your MBA admissions campaign. I always recommend you want someone who knows grammar. They can review those essays through and through from a English lens standpoint. Someone who knows the school and this process is very important so that they ensure that you're really bringing about and highlighting the right pieces of your candidacy for an MBA in general and for that school specifically. And then someone who knows you. When you read through, when you're working on your essays, you're going to be so ingrained in those. You are going to have seen so many different versions of that thing that you're going to be sick of looking at it. So by the end, you may not even know, what you're looking for anymore. So I think it's very important that you have someone who knows you that can read through that essay set before you ultimately submit and say, do I really see John Doe when I read this? To ensure that you're really bringing your authentic self to the picture. Now, if you are someone who's engaging an MBA admissions firm, and if that firm does it right, they truly could actually check all 3 of these boxes. They'll know grammar, they're going to know the school and the process, and they are going to get to know you intimately throughout the process. However, regardless, I still recommend, even if you're working with an MBA admissions firm, that you have another person in your corner, a friend or family member who you've known for ideally a decade or more, who knows you in and out, that can read through that MBA, those MBA essays and really say, yes, I see authentically you in this essay set. I think it's very, very important.
Thank you, Talon. Now let's look at how this kind of all comes together in terms of the timeline. We have a limited amount of time left before all these components have to come together. And what we generally would say is look at the submission date, look at the deadline, and kind of work backwards. If you might think about, well, I got to jump into the essays. And ultimately, it really starts with the strategy and that self-reflection, introspection piece of what have I done so far in my life, professionally, personally, for a community, in terms of outreach. Take stock. Okay, take stock first, but really think of that first as you're working backwards. Ultimately, too, one thing that kind of we see a lot is there's this, the online application, data entry, I'll just kind of do that at the couple days before. That is actually quite the opposite thinking you want to have. Because what happens is with the online application, it's not a one size fits all. And you will find that if you studied an exchange program in university or college, you have other transcripts that need to be transferred. You started in one college and then transferred to another. It can get complicated very fast, and it's not like registrars and university transcripts and official ones are necessarily readily available and can be kind of emailed to you per se. So within 24 hours. So you really want to look at the online applications very early as you look at the submission date and think about what is awkward, what is not, how am I different in terms of what a school is asking, and why don't I fit in? And do you need to reach out to admissions to ask? That's an important point in these final weeks where you might think that, well, they're inundated and busy, which might be true, but it's very important to tell you that admissions folks are, in a concise messaging manner, are very responsive. If you have a situation that doesn't meet the online application, we're big believers in not taking any chances and just kindly write them and say, look, I have this issue. How should I handle it in terms of the dialogue box or the entry point? That is totally normal to do. The thing is just keep it brief, and they will respond. It's something that I want to kind of put in people's heads, because I think it's much more safer than taking the risk that you kind of answered something incorrectly or didn't understand the intent of one of those online questions. So this is what we mean by those seemingly minor but big app components. The online application, I can't stress enough, is something you want to start early. Talon kind of referenced this a bit, but recommenders are very critical to this sort of the ingredients of this entire recipe. And what happens, especially in this time of year, depending on the country, you'll get some vacations and get people going away, especially in a real non-major pandemic time that we had, like a few years ago. So get them in early, just to let them know once you've chosen them, let them know that this might be coming and make it as efficient and easy for them as possible. A lot of recommenders think that these are actual letters. So they kind of get into this idea of, well, I'll just take one that I wrote for you for a job interview, prior spring, or part of a performance review. Part of the performance review, as Talon pointed out, is hugely valuable, but they're not really letters. They're responses to questions, and of course, many of them are similar across schools. As I said, the online app, I kind of did these in reverse, but that is definitely something that will creep up on people. And a classic example, just so you all are aware, if you haven't been in the online apps yet, you'll see something where it'll say, 500 characters. Those are typically 500 characters with spaces when you do the word count. And that can make a very big difference when you're listing extracurriculars and whatnot. So just be very judicious with your words, and every space will count, as it often does on your resume, because the resume too is going to be generally one page, except if you're applying to executive programs. So the timeline is, again, it can be fluid, it can be organic, but give you some internal and due dates that you can set for yourself, as well as your recommenders, so that they're submitting on time as well.
All right, moving into number 3. It's very important that you have a catalog of what those top experiences are that you even want to highlight through your MBA admissions journey. And I say, and use them religiously. So if you do the upfront introspection and planning or discovery process correct before you even engage in your essays, which I guess John will talk about in a little bit there, you will know exactly what you want to talk about before you even start writing. And you want to use those experiences that you know are your best religiously throughout the process. Now, how do you really get there to do that? First of all, I would say jot down what your biggest win is and what your biggest area of growth is for each role that you've had in your career. This would be things like areas that you've demonstrated leadership or teamwork, or where you actually encountered, a problem and made a mistake and grew from it. where you've worked with folks who are different than you and the challenges that you've overcome in doing that. And of course, where you've delivered the most impactful results for the organization or for people. Honestly, areas of growth are probably as important, if not more important, than those areas where you've had the most impactful results. This shows that you're reflective, it shows that you're coachable, and that you are going to continue to get better over time, not only as an MBA student, but throughout the rest of your career. And when you think about how to identify those things, I would definitely be thinking about both at work as well as your impact in the community. And you may want to even parse them out a little bit separately. Hey, maybe it's that you're looking for, 3 experiences at work and 2 in the community, just to showcase, your true well-roundedness. And I would think about, what are those key things that any MBA admissions committee is looking for, right? It's teamwork, it's leadership, it's cross-cultural or global perspective, right? And make sure that those experiences that you're highlighting really showcase those types of skills and learning. Now, you have to narrow down and prioritize, though. If you've got a catalog of 50 to 100 experiences, that's not what's going to get you success, especially in an efficient way that you need within weeks before the MBA admissions deadline. I would really think about this catalog of experiences that you pull together in a similar way that you think about a job interview, right? If you go in and you try to remember 50 experiences that you've had and jog your memory real time as an interviewer is asking you a question, you're never going to get the best results as if you walk in there knowing your 5 to 7 experiences that best communicate your candidacy. And that is exactly how you want to narrow down and prioritize those experiences that you keep top of mind throughout your MBA admissions journey. And then as you are creating this catalog of your experiences, I really encourage you to use the STAR method and add an L. That's kind of a little trick that not everybody knows about. I would say many people are familiar with the STAR method, which I'll explain in a second. But adding that L is really the linchpin that can differentiate you. So for those who are not familiar with the STAR method, it's a way of describing your experiences in a method that allows someone who wasn't there and doesn't know what you're talking about to quickly grasp the situation, which is the S, the task that was at hand for you to embark on, what specific action you took in this particular situation, and then ultimately, what was the result? What happened as a result of that action that you took? Now, this L, though, that really tends to be the differentiator is, but what did you learn from that experience? As you reflected, again, showcasing to AdCom that you are a reflective person, that you are self-aware, right? What did you learn from that process? And then how has it made you better because you've had that learning? If you do this right and you have this nice catalog of your experiences, it will come in handy forever. You'll use it not only, to write your essays, but you'll use it for your interviews for your MBA application. You'll use it for interviews for jobs. And then maybe even, later on in your career, your second or third post-MBA job, you'll have a nice repository of the great experiences that you've had that you can tap into and remember with pretty deep level of detail, more so than you would had you not written them down and maintained this document going forward. I also do encourage you've got to get personal, right? You want to present and bring forth your entire self in this MBA admissions journey. It's not just about what you've done in your career. It's so much more than that. I even encourage you to go back a decade ago, 2 decades ago, to things that happened in your childhood that really have shaped you into who you are and ultimately created that source of motivation for your goal. It's really important that your goals are authentic and believable. And so AdCom doesn't want to think that, oh, hey, you just woke up yesterday and decided that you wanted to go into consulting. Maybe it's something that happened to you when you were 8 years old that, that has really made you compelled, to believe and be passionate in a certain area that then ultimately, has shaped your long-term goals. And at the time, you probably didn't even realize that it was happening. But if you reflect, again, being reflective and self-aware is important. You'll realize that it was something that actually happened to you, in grammar school or university. So I encourage you to bring the personal side of you into things as well.
Thank you, Talon. And we have a question, so we'll jump into that right now. And both of us will take, we'll answer this for you. And the question comes from a Grim, which is, hey, is it possible to get into a good university for MBA with looks like 56% CGPA, I assume, in graduation, 3 years of work experience, and a good GMAT? So it depends on a bunch of things here. As Talon just said, the personal shaping incidents, the drive, the anchor, the goals, all that stuff we're kind of not considering when we answer this. But generally, to the top schools, the numbers, the academics, a lot of people are going to have great numbers. But often there'll be one weakening point. Either the test score is low, the GPA is high, or the GPA is low and the test score is high. It's rare over the years that I've done these that I've seen someone that really has everything kind of worked out. There could have been a recommender that's not as great, all sorts of things. Generally, I've seen over the past few cycles, the GPA, even depending on the amount of time you've been out, still is getting a lot more weight than you might realize. Some people will have legitimate reasons, health reasons, trauma reasons, tragedy reasons, and then just, hey, I overextended myself reasons for not having a decent GPA. So I think the years of work experience it's kind of in the sweet spot. Again, what kind of work experience, we don't know. So I have to caveat that as well as the GMAT. But generally, Graham, I'd say there are ways to kind of address a low GPA. And I don't think it's necessarily going to ruin one's chances per se. Oftentimes it can be a waitlist decision, especially in a round one environment where they're like, we see that we want to see some more, maybe do a course outside or outside of work or an online course, but something to show quantitative analytical ability if that GPA has a lot of hits to it on a mathematical front, let's say. So I'll let Talon jump in as well, but I hope that's helpful.
I think you really nailed it, John. Ultimately, I would say hopefully there's a good reason for the 56% that you can then explain what you learned from that experience and why you are different now. And you would actually show up ready to handle that academic rigor at an MBA program in a way that's going to, give you better results. So I think it's really about what you learned from that experience and how you've grown since will be really critical to showcase. And, if you do have a good GMAT, whatever good means, it probably does show that, hey, you've got some smarts to back it up. So as long as you've truly learned from that university experience and won't repeat that again, that could give you a good shot.
And everyone on the call, as a quick example, I took the GMAT 3 times. I had a 510, I think a 580 and a 610. I have a history of not testing well, the medical school exam, everything. So I kind of came clean and said, look, this is what I got. And these are the strengths, these are the weaknesses. I just accepted it. I didn't get in the first year I applied. But I kind of stuck with it and did an extra course in statistics. So I think, I'm a big believer in focusing on your strengths and finding ways to kind of make you kind of jump out as opposed to just the numbers. Because again, a lot of people applying to top schools work hard. They stay late at work. They get there early. That's not differentiating. It's the soul of you, the time when you were 8 and something triggered an interest in operations or supply chain. And yes, those are stories we've seen. So that's the fire, the passion, the stake in the ground that they want to see. Now, everyone's favorite, essay writing. Well, at least for me, because I was an English major, so I've written a lot of essays in my life. And I write every day, poems, lyrics, songs, stanzas, you name it. So one of the things that I think a lot of people get into the problem of is they don't follow instructions first in a lot of these applications. So they kind of are like, well, I've done well in my life. I'll just get into these top schools. I'll just, write some essays. And these questions are given for a reason by certain schools. A school signals in some way, I think, what they're looking for based on their essay questions. So you could have the classic why school and what are your short-term or long-term goals. That says a lot versus what's your favorite film, movie, or book, and tell me about your three values that drive you. Very different signal there. So read the prompt, read the question, and then build your outline off of that. So if it says, tell me about your greatest challenge and what you learned, to go to Talon's point about STAR, one of the things that people think is at the end of the question, it's kind of like when you write the essay, you sort of trail off at the end of 500 words because the last part said what you learned. Well, actually, in an essay like that, what you learned and the growth from it is actually probably more words, weighting of words than you might think. Just because it's at the end of the prompt doesn't mean it's not less significant. So you have to equally weight these components. And again, using the STAR L method at times, depending on the prompt, of course, what would take them into the situation, take them like cinematography into the scene. Talk about the challenge, maybe. Was it leadership? Was it people? Was it process? The result or how you apply the result. Again, it can be different, but parse out the question and then build your outline off of that. You'll find they almost start to write themselves, and at least getting the words out. The hardest part with essay writing, especially in the final weeks, is starting. Just start. Just get everything down. And whether you're working with a consultant or not, if you start that first draft, you could look at it the next day, and then you sort of say, oh, like that's too generic. Can I replace that generic clause with something specific? Was it a client, or was it a healthcare client, or was it a medical device client? Again, you'll finesse it in the end with the word count, and you might have to strip some details around. But when in doubt, classic phrases. For example, there was a time when, particularly, specifically, be specific. The outline is something that I think everyone sort of has a different view on how deep that should be. All the years I've written, an outline is just that. It's an outline. Similar to like when you go into an interview situation, you don't want to be so rehearsed and have everything on your index cards. You want to have a sense of what's coming, but be able to sort of adapt to your wording around the theme or the story that you're presenting to. It also avoids you from answering the question similar to an essay that is not the correct or a question and answer to the incorrect question. So it's kind of like listening, but you're doing it in a writing sense. The narrative version and moving to that when you're really ready. This is sort of after the outline and you start to put in what is that leadership story of that part of the essay. That's a separate paragraph. Okay, my conclusion is going to be the lessons I learned. You start to kind of get the pieces of the cinematography scene, if you will. What are you putting in the foreground? What are you putting in the background? Again, it's a lot like cinematography, and we'll conclude with a metaphor with the movies later at the end as well. Proofreading, formatting. I'm a big stickler with this because having worked in finance for a long time and done a lot of presentations where you're reading very small 8-point compliance disclosures, everything is fair game. And you have to think that these competitive schools, with all these applications, if they have to find a reason to toss someone and reject someone for being sloppy, they might do it. So really focus on, is there an extra space when you accept changes or you're editing? Do you have the period inside the quotation marks or outside? I mean, I'm getting super detailed, but these are the types of things that show that you spent a lot of time and really took a lot of care. One thing in the final weeks you should really know is that and a lot of people rush. Round two, to go to this again, round one versus round two, a lot of people say, well, round two is going to be, I'm not going to be as competitive. A lot of people rush round two because they get the decisions in December and maybe they didn't get in or where they wanted to go. Suddenly they've got to just cobble together applications again. So that's another reason why there's a lot more parity per se, but also in this particular environment, the round one, I think overweight is the way to go. So in terms of what we're seeing right now. But again, proofread, format, get someone else to look at it. But another point on that is you don't want to have endless people reviewing your essays. This is a point that we find can get a little bit, because everyone's going to have subjective opinions. And you might think, well, someone got into a school, then they must be an expert. There's so many essays that come in and for a given year, they are not all going to be the same or have all the same components. So be careful to say that just because someone got into the school, that their answer or their view on my essay is the correct one.
I love that last point, John. It oftentimes through this process, you do have a number of people review your essays and, you've got your board of directors and things like that, right? But that is why that person who knows you is so important to review the essay before you turn it in. Because, a smart person does engage others in this process, but again, you don't want to overdo it. And that kind of sense check on if you did overdo it would be that board of director who knows you and can read through and say, is this still authentically John Doe? Because so many other people have kind of looked at this and given you advice. You have to stay true to yourself, right? You can't take all of the advice and apply it all. And it's probably going to be conflicting too if you engage too many people. And that's why at the end, you just have to make sure that your authentic self is still there in those essays. Okay, last but not least, number 5, network strategically and efficiently with the schools on your list. But you only have 3 to 5 weeks, before these round 1 applications are due, right? So how do you do that in a way that will really get you the biggest impact? I first want to start by explaining, why do you even want to talk to these folks at the school, right? It's really a dual benefit. First is for you to showcase your deep interest in the school. Sure, throughout your essays, you may reference, one person that you spoke to in this from the school. Don't reference 3 to 5. I mean, that is just name dropping for the sake of name dropping. It is not going to get you anywhere. Which is why you don't need to talk to that many people, right? If you are very strategic about the conversations that you're having with folks from the school, you really only need to probably talk to 1 or 2 of them. Who do you want? And then the second reason, I guess, is really to get on their radar. So if you talk to the right people, these could be people who could actually work really powerfully for you throughout the admissions process. AdCom, of course, getting on their radar early before you even submit that application certainly can work to your benefit. Professors can often be advocates for you as well. If you have a great conversation with a professor, they may proactively choose to reach out to AdCom and say, hey, I spoke to so-and-so, and I would love for them to become my student one day. Alumni chapter heads. Now, this is one that often goes untouched and unnoticed, but can give you a real strategic advantage, because these alumni chapter heads, they are very passionate about their schools. They're very connected to their schools, and they may feel compelled on their own to be proactive about letting AdCom know what a great conversation that they had with you. So that is a great choice, for someone to reach out to. And then there's kind of the typical, right? Alum, current students, maybe even club officers for clubs that you're interested in. But any of these people, could serve as, good advocates and referrals for you. Even some schools like Fuqua, as an example, have an actual referral process that current students actually engage in when they talk to folks. They'll actually send AdCom, hey, yeah, I talked to so-and-so, and I think they'd be great for the program, or not so great, right? But one thing that people often struggle with is, gosh, I don't even know what to say, right? How do I go about this conversation in a way that gets someone to listen to me and want to chat with me, right? And so, I don't know, one example, if you were to engage with an alumni chapter head, let's say, you could say, hey, I consider my future role as an alum to be just as important and rewarding as being a student. How could I get involved post my MBA at such and such a program? And that is something that'll really warm them up, right? They're clearly very passionate as an alumni chapter head about their role as an alum. And then they would want to be an advocate for someone who shares that same passion, right? So just kind of get in the heads of that person that you're speaking to about what's important to them, and how can you kind of, establish that rapport and credibility for things that they care about. I do think that anyone that you're talking to, it's very smart to just say, hey, what were your best or most meaningful experiences at business school? Whether that be a club experience, a conference experience, a professor, that gives you real meaningful and tangible things to reference in an authentic way in your essays and interviews. And then, ultimately, I would say, asking, are there any specific suggestions that you have on how I could maximize my chances for admission? I'm so deeply interested in this school that, I'm looking for any advice that you might have. That's a very smart question to ask as well, that can really help to boost your candidacy in those final weeks. I would keep the conversation relatively short. These folks that you'll be reaching out to, their time is very valuable, and you want them to know that you value their time. So really approach the conversation with intent. Have your list of questions that you want to ask ready to go, so that it's a productive call. And then, of course, follow up and thank them. That just really shows that you're a good person, and again, that you value their time.
Great. Thank you, Talon. And look, we have a few questions that came in, so we're going to wait and do those. We're going to finish this up, and then we'll go to the questions. Some good ones came in. And actually one really relevant to this slide that we were just on. But we'll get to that in a sec. But let's talk about the final push here. One thing that Talon and I have talked about a lot, and we talk about internally, is this idea of a trailer to a really awesome movie. And if you think about the intent of a trailer, it's to kind of like a sizzle reel, a corporate sizzle reel or a startup sizzle reel. It's supposed to sort of get interest and get deep interest and excitement, enthusiasm. So in this case, it'd be enthusiasm for you, for the applicant. It's not necessarily showing everything, but it's vignettes. It's little things here and there that kind of show potential. Often in the business school context, right, it's going to be leadership potential, which is one of the kind of buzzy words and buzzy phrases that you're going to see a lot, but it's very much true. So you want to think of it as, am I showing a broad swath of myself versus kind of redundancy? You want to use the application to show within the instructions and guidelines, of course, within sort of as many different pieces of you per se than just nailing one point over the head that you're great at operations. That they'll get that in one example. Now, this is very important, which even gets to the CV resume, is your job, the broad job process with a CV or a resume is much different than the MBA admissions one. This is not like, hey, here are my skills and I'm a good fit for the job because of those skills. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. It's, here are my goals, here are my values, here's what I have, here's what I'm missing. And hey, you Tuck or you Sloan or you Haas, you're ideally placed because of the amalgam, the palette of all that. Because they know you're kind of throwing darts often at the top schools in some ways. But who really shines, those are the people that come across as genuinely authentic and sincere. They know the city. They know what the city the school's in and what some of those needs are. Oh, and hey, maybe you mentored children a lot. Well, maybe that school has a huge need for youth mentoring in a certain area. You put yourself on campus. It's a psychological sort of, it's how prosecutors will do this in front of a jury. They're trying to put someone at the scene. It's the similar kind of method. Now, your goals. Goals you're going to hear about. They are incredibly important, perhaps the anchor of your application. But they know they will change, and they do often. The idea, though, is that you are coming in with some sort of plan. I didn't get in my first year because I kind of just waxed on about microfinance and Muhammad Yunus, actually, and saving the world through microfinance. I had no path to employment at all. It's key that you sort of show what you've done, what you're missing, and then combining the MBA, they're going to be the launch pad to your future. Of course, those goals may change, but they need to see some sort of semblance of where you want to go, as opposed to, I want to go back and explore. That's the wrong word. Or I want to go back and do this or that. If you use or, that's a rejection as well. So applications, similar to dating. You want to sort of have the first date and then maybe say, oh, I'd love to meet that person again, but you haven't learned everything about that person yet. It's this idea of wanting more, wanting to see that person more, wanting to learn more. That's what gets you ultimately an interview, because you can't get into school for the most part, or can't get an interview, right? Unless there's some ones that you can volunteer. There are few of those, right? But the idea is you're never going to get into school unless you get the interview. So the whole thinking is what's best to get their interest, to bring me in and say, we want to see this person beyond the paper, beyond the letters, and so to speak. Now, lastly, on the interview front, it's this idea of hireability and getting that internship, or if let's say it's a 2-year program. There has to be some sense that you not only have a plan, but you have some credibility. So there's a question that's come up, which we're going to talk about, where you have someone who has a law background and they want to go into consulting, and we'll talk about how that should shape out. But confidence is not necessarily saying, well, they're going to get that investment banking job. It's to just give them a sense that if you go into that interview for that summer internship, let's say, you are not going in completely kind of in this exploratory, huge transition mode. So transitions are a delicate thing with an MBA admissions. You do want to transition and maybe go somewhere else, but you first have to prove that you need the MBA, and you can't just laterally do that. That's an important point a lot of people miss. So there has to be a true need for this degree. There has to be, look, I admit I have all this stuff from consulting at McKinsey, but I'm missing all this other stuff. You have to just be vulnerable. And vulnerability is a very important part of the application. A lot of folks who are sort of driven type A people who are applying to these programs want to come across as like the clean slate. I could not disagree with you more. You've got to show vulnerability, because if you don't have vulnerability, where have you grown? And to go back to Talon's earlier point. So we'll answer questions shortly, but with that, we thank you. I'll let Talon chime in as well, but we thank you for taking the time to listen to us. Before we get to questions, you can find much more information about us on our websites, where we have free consultations and such, but just want to say thank you before we finish with questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, John. Now I will go to the chat box and start with the first question. I want to actually address the very last question that has come in because it's really directly related to one of the things that I had talked about. The question comes down to, hey, alumni from a few schools are just really hard to get connected with. So any recommendations on how to get connected with them? I would say, from my perspective, the best way to do this is really by leveraging LinkedIn. But I think that it comes down to how you communicate and engage with them in terms of why you want to talk to them. I think establishing common ground, finding something, some common interest in someone's background can really make them feel more compelled to say yes to taking that call with you. I do this when I'm looking for a job as well, is I go on LinkedIn, I say, hey, who's worked at similar companies as me? Who went to a similar undergrad university as me? Who's connected to, who's shares a network with me? And then when I reach out to them, I say, hey, I see that you're a Wisconsin alum as well. Like, go Badgers, right? Hey, I'm really interested in going to Kellogg, and I see that you're also a Kellogg alum. I'd love to chat through with you how someone who went to Wisconsin-Madison, could become a Kellogg alum. So just saying something that kind of sparks their interest, as opposed to, hey, can you chat about, MIT Sloan? You really need to give them an invested interest in you. So that can tend to get you better results than just kind of a blind, cold call out there. But alum are not the only folks that you need to reach out to. There was that whole list that I had in there. So there's other avenues as well. But if it is alum that you absolutely do want to speak to for whatever reason, you could go to the alumni chapter website, and on there you will at a minimum find that, alumni chapter head and their contact information. And then again, if you kind of approach them in a similar way that I had mentioned before around, hey, my role as an alumni is as important to me as, my time as a student. I'd love to chat with you about your role as an alumni chapter head and how one day when I'm an alum, I can deliver as much meaningful impact as you are in your role. So it's really, in my opinion, all about that positioning. I would also say, if you really can't find anybody, who will respond to your message, or anyone with similar connections, I would just really get creative, right? Maybe it's going to a school website and finding a professor to reach out to. Maybe it's going to the school website and looking at a club that you are interested in and contacting that club head. Who's a current student. So there are many different avenues for you to learn about the school. And if the first ones that you're approaching don't pan out, I encourage you to keep trying.
And I think I'll jump in with Tarun's question of choosing a career in consulting post experience in law. What specific areas to focus on in the essays? So great question. I again, for me, who's kind of a lot of different sectors I worked in, I love this kind of stuff. So it's all about applying what you've done. So I worked with a client last year who law school, and then did get into a number of MBA programs. And the idea was that let's start with the goals. Where does he want to go short-term, long-term? Then we adjusted the resume, of course, to kind of pair to some of those skills to show what he does have to get there, because it was a bit of a transition. So the idea is, what in law often teaches you how to think and approach problems analytically in a different way. Well, what a better way to start than to think of the approaching a client when you're doing strategy consulting for a supply chain, where you're like, hey, I know how to think in a certain way based on what law brings. Plus, you're bringing a whole overlay of, the ethical piece, or the right and wrong, or being able to challenge someone who has an idea for a consulting client, has an idea they want to implement, but there could be legal ramifications. You have the thinking to ask the right questions that maybe a PowerPoint deck wouldn't pick up, or someone who's purely a strategy consultant. So don't ever think about what you don't have. Think about what you bring. And this is where a lot of my career has been, on sort of adapting what I have into something else. So in fact, I'm excited for you. I think you can present a really cool case. And also, you're differentiating. How many people have law backgrounds are going into strategy consulting? Not that many in terms of via the MBA. And then I'll let Talon, I'll take one more and then get back to her. This was, hi, John. If someone has a low GPA for the first couple of years, but then a 9+ in the final year, can adding Coursera certificates help? That's the only one thing I have instead of participating in round one. So Didier, yes, it can. First of all, they love to see improvement. I started with a 2.5 out of 4 in the US. I got it to a 3.3. And as everyone on the call knows, turning around a GPA is hard, and you don't need to do statistics and MBA to know that in that short amount of time. So I was happy with that, but yeah, and a lot of people we see don't have extremely high GPAs. In terms of the Indian demographic, just for those who are concerned, the typical I see is somewhere in that kind of low to mid 7s. Rarely do I see anything in the 9s, and a little bit in the 8s, but typically it's in that kind of 70% range. So I think Coursera works. You see Berkeley Extension, Harvard stuff. You see a lot of people do those, especially with the pandemic. And again, one thing, and Talon we kind of alluded to this, is round one versus round two. Also, you want to apply in the round when you can present your best self. So it's better to do round two with a higher test score than a round one with a lower. And that may seem kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised in the psychology of round one, people forget that. So it'd be better for you to maybe boost that up and kind of handle that trajectory with the GPA with a round two attempt versus round one.
Thank you, John. I'm going to go back to legalities here. We have a question around, could you share your views on putting the actual client names versus healthcare client, for example? I don't want to do the name dropping, especially if it's not helpful. This one, I think, just really comes down to whether there's confidentiality in your, client agreement. So if you were consulting, pre-MBA, right, there is often, a lot of things that you can't specifically share about who it is that you work with. So sometimes then you do need to say, oh, a top 5 healthcare company, or, a big 5, whatever that is. I think that what's important, if you cannot use the actual client name, would be to then add some sort of a qualifier for what makes this client impactful, right? Maybe they are your 3rd biggest client for the whole company. Maybe they are of X size, right? Multi-billion-dollar client. Maybe, they're industry leading, in whatever industry that they play in. So I think that can help to add merit and credibility to, the impact that your work has, if you are not able to actually name the client. So I would just, really think through what that confidentiality agreement looks like. But if you can actually name the client, yes, go right ahead and do so, especially if it's a big name that'll add credibility to your resume. I'm not worried about name dropping when it comes to like your resume or your experience. The name dropping comment that I had made earlier, if this is at all in reference to that, is when you're speaking to folks associated with the school, you want to make sure that when you reference that you spoke to them, that it's in an authentic way. Not just, oh, I talked to these 5 people and I know I want to go to the school. It's, oh, I talked to so-and-so. And when I heard them speak about how truly life-changing their experience was in this global consulting class they were able to take, it made me so excited about how much I will grow on my own, at MIT Sloan or whatever it is. So you just really need to make sure that when you're dropping those names, it has meaning and it's authentic. But when it comes to the resume or your work experience, absolutely name drop all day. Those big names speak volumes on your resume, if you can within your client agreement.
Thanks, Talon. Well, we'll take 2 more quick questions. One, to Tarun had a follow-up about your goals. Yes, you will be specific in terms of the position post-MBA and potentially sample companies. You really have to go to that level of detail. So yes, you wouldn't just say you want to go into consulting. You want to talk about the title and where you might want to do that, what region, specifics. The more specifics, the better. And lastly, someone brought up financial aid. So typically, financial aid is not something, look at it 2 ways. There can be ones you can apply for based on demographic, ethnicity, ethnic background, and so on. And then there's sort of just the merit scholarship money that's given out, which is typically given out in round 1, not really in round 2, which is more reason sometimes to apply round 1. It's basically blind. I mean, there's not much we know about it. So if you're looking for merit scholarship money, that will be something that you will get a letter, kind of an update with when you're admitted. Then, though, you want to look into if there are any financial aid specific scholarships to which you can apply for. Maybe it's additional essay, a reference letter. Those you want to look at early on. All right. Well, if that's it, first of all, first I'll just say thank you to Talon for all her great insights. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope this was helpful. I know we spoke a lot. Maybe I spoke fast, but I want to make sure I give as much info. And again, you know how to get to us. And I'll let Talon get the final words.
Absolutely. I would say, hey, procrastinators unite, right? That's what we're all here for, whether you are actually a procrastinator or you've just found yourself considering, hey, do I still have time for those round one applications? Hopefully the advice that John and I shared today gives you that faith and hope that absolutely, you can do it if you are dedicated enough and willing to carve out the time and set aside some vacation time, as John had kind of mentioned, and kind of laying out your timeline there. And then also, if we can be of help, let's meet. We would love to have a conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone.